Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Berglund. I hope you are having a great day. I hope you've been learning a lot. As the title says, this is reporting tips for beginners and intermediates. If you're an expert, you might not pick up as much here, but and I have advanced presentations if you're ever interested on feature writing as well as sports investigative journalism. But again, today's just built for especially beginners and intermediates, people who might have covered some sports but don't have a lot of experience. So I hope these tips are very helpful for you. So I'll begin first with a little bit of introduction to me, and then we'll move on to more interesting things. Again, my name is Bob Berglund, and I teach at Northwest Missouri State University. And just again, a little bit of background. I was a sports athlete as some of you guys were in high school. There's me, my lovely brother running 5Ks and 10Ks. Me at Millikan University. So again, I wrote also, as many of you have, for my high school paper, and then went on to write for the student newspaper at Millikan University and three other newspapers as well. So some other athletic background. I've done a few Chicago marathons as well as the Boston Marathon. Some other things, I've recently gotten into doing triathlons, including an Ironman triathlon in 2015. More recently, doing a triathlon with my son, Mr. Muscles there. And again, even getting into curling. So, love of sports, love of doing sports, love of reporting sports. And again, I teach sports reporting at Northwest Missouri State and love it. So yes, so just some other experiences I've had in terms of journalism in addition to writing for newspapers, also doing freelance writing, so parlaying that experience doing things like curling into writing for Men's Journal. A couple other publications I've written for include the magazine Men's Health. I'm doing a story on presidential candidate Gary Johnson. And my favorite one of all time for Deer and Deer Hunting magazine, doing one on dear old mom. Doing a piece on her bagging a deer for the 50th consecutive year. So, anyway, so I come to you again with a love of sports, a love of reporting on sports, and also, of course, a love of teaching sports and sports reporting. And so that's why I'm here today as well. So, just to give a little bit of background as far as the context of what you'll be writing. So, as you're doing this too, obviously, as you've probably already seen, you'll need to be watching this on a laptop or a regular computer. The On a small screen, a lot of this is going to be pretty tough to see. So, just giving you a little bit of background about where sports reporting fits in the kind of the grand scheme of things. So, I have kind of an overview of some of the types of things you might see in a newspaper. On the very subjective side, you see, again, on the far subjective side, you see columns written in first person I, editorials written as the opinion of the newspaper. On the far end of the spectrum, you have those hard news stories like crime and courts and fire, disasters, things dealing with death. And those, of course, you want to be super, super objective with, be very careful with. Some of the other stories with meetings, for example, there's obviously a lot of subjectivity in terms of what you choose to include in your story, even more so with speech stories as far as what quotes you include and who you choose to interview after the speech about reactions to that. So, still in the objective category. A little bit further on down the road are the sports and feature stories, which, again, you should be an objective journalist, but there's a chance for in these stories to have a little bit more voice, and also, again, some subjectivity comes in. So in terms of sports, that subjectivity comes in especially in terms of what you include in the story. So usually the statistics you include, the narrative of the game, if you're covering a game, is focused mainly on the readership, the team that is in your readership area. So you're going to be biased, of course, in terms of what you include. You're going to include more stats from your players, if you're covering, for example, your high school team or your college team later. You're going to cover, again, you're more likely to quote from those coaches and players from your team. You're more likely to include the stats from that. But it's very important here, and I put this in all caps here. Your job is not to be a cheerleader as a sports reporter. So do not use I, do not use we, do not, again, give overly biased statements regarding your team. Okay. One other way that sports are similar to features in terms of where they're on the spectrum, and also, of course, how they're written, is that again these are stories that, unlike taxes and death and things like that, these are not stories that generally impact readers' lives. And so you need a way to pull those readers in, and you have more liberty then too in drafting these leads that pull the reader in, that hook the reader. So those are some things to think of as we go through this here today. And so today I'm going to focus again on writing especially game wrap-up stories. So these are the biggest staple of reporting, for sports reporting. At the end of the presentation here, I'll get into dealing with some more things, some other types of stories you can cover. But my tips here are focused on game wrap-up stories because those really comprise the bulk of the type of stories most people write. So without further ado, we'll get into some more of these. So just to give an example of a type of story too. So this is to kind of describe where we're going with this. So here's a traditional lead. So this is a lead that might be written for a regular story. So you've probably learned about inverted pyramid and writing summary leads that are one sentence and under 25 words and contain the most important 5 W's and H. And so, your regular straight news lead might be something like this. Dana Quigley won the Northville Classic Senior PGA event Saturday in Long Island. Okay, it has the who, it has the what, it has the when, it has the where. Okay, but this is not a good sports lead. So this might be a fine if this was a news type story lead, summing up the big important stuff, but not for a sports lead, because again, you typically want to have more information and more creativity. So just to show you an example of a lead that steps it up a notch, Dana Quigley parred the third playoff hole to beat Joel Siegel and win the Northville Classic Senior PGA event Sunday in Long Island. Okay, so here we have a little bit of the how, as far as how we won. That extra detail makes it a little bit more interesting, so that's a better lead. But give you another example here. So this is the one that was actually published in the Associated Press. The joy of Dana Quigley's first senior PGA Tour victory was quickly tempered with the news of his father's death. Quigley made a 2.5-foot par putt on the third playoff hole to defeat Jay Siegel and win the $1 million Northville Classic on Sunday. After the presentation ceremony, Quigley, a two-time winner of the main open, received a call from his brother Paul informing him that 92-year-old Wallace Quigley had succumbed to cancer only hours earlier in a hospital in Providence. So here we have, again, going beyond this and figuring out what is the most important, what is the most interesting part of the story. And number one, this is his first PGA story, but two, of course, the news of his dad's death. And so we still have what's called this nut paragraph in the second paragraph, filling in those key details. But anyway, it's more interesting. It covers more of what really is interesting about the story. Taking it up a notch even further is the New York Times. So go ahead and I'll just give a quick read to this, and I'll give you silence to read. Obviously, if I start in, and you're welcome to just pause this video. So go ahead and give it a read. Okay, you can see this is more than just a regular sports story. The reporter here, again, found out that this guy's dad died, and that became the story. That was the most important thing. That was the story of this golf tournament, is this guy winning his first golf tournament and not doing it quite soon enough for his dad to know that he had that first victory. So we have lots of description here. One of the great things about this lead is it puts you in the story. It puts you in the event here. So the use of description of him collapsing alone on the grass in tears. We have him sobbing as he stepped into the interview room, hugging his wife. Okay, so we have this description here, this narrative story as well, that pulls you into the moment and gives you that story. So not all games are like this. Not all athletic events are going to have this sort of drama, but it's important to always try and find what is the story of this game. What is the most interesting thing? And the way to think about it is think of if you are a, the beat writer for the Kansas City Royals, and you're covering 160 plus games over the course of the year. Hopefully, even extra ones if they make the playoffs. But you're covering so many games. What makes this game different from all the others? What is the story of this game? What is interesting, different about this game? And so more than anything, your job as a sports reporter is to find out what is that interesting thing and play that up in at least the very first part of your story, the lead. So I'm going to show some examples here, some quick examples. I'm going to have you read a little bit of this story here. And this is an ancient story, but I've kept it because there's a great other example from a different newspaper that covered the same event. So go ahead and again, take just a couple minutes here and read. You won't get to the end of it here, but read the first at least column here plus. Okay, so just kind of go through and analyze this. This isn't a bad story. The lead has a little bit extra information in terms of some past history. It has again the score. Usually you want to include the score somewhere in the first paragraph, if not, or the very least the first two or three paragraphs. So it's not too bad. Again, it maybe goes into a little bit of extra depth here on this past history that maybe isn't quite as critical, but not bad. Here we have this third paragraph is pretty good. Okay, the game was won an 8-yard touchdown run, a touchdown pass from Gerald Posey to Anthony Copeland in the overtime. So we have that detail. Obviously, the overtime win, how they won this game, is important. So that's relatively high up in the story, which is good. We have this other, we have kind of extra detail here that maybe again high up in the story isn't that critical. We have this defensive back and kicker out, but again that isn't critical to this story. We do have senior night, so it's senior day. We have that information, so that's good. Whether it needs to go this early, not so sure. We do have a quote, so it's good to have a quote in your story. Usually you want to include that in the second, third, usually in the third or fourth paragraph you want to have a quote there. So we don't know before the quote who's speaking, so it would have been good to identify who's speaking before the quote. But it is good to have this quote. You can see it's a little bit long, deep into the story before we get that. We have a lot of details, a lot of stats. Okay, so probably a little bit too much there. Like, again, they won the battle, the first downs, not probably deeper in than we need to go. You can see the way they organize the story is by chronological order. So we have, here's what happened in the first half or the first quarter. Okay, game remained until the second quarter. Okay, went in this at the first half. Okay, and then went into halftime. Then the third quarter. So it's going in chronological order, which sometimes works, but that's something to keep in mind with your when covering a game is you want to focus on the most important stuff, and that most important stuff might not be in the first quarter, it may be at the very end of the game. And if you put all that information at the end of the game, that buries it. And when that is the most important thing. So from an inverted pyramid standpoint, again, you want to put the most important stuff at the top of the story and think about, again, what is that most important stuff. So again, not a bad story, but a few things could have been stronger here. But I'd like you to give a read from the other account of this game. So Missouri Western senior tight end Anthony Copeland entered Saturday's season finale against Central Missouri State with one career reception, a 15-yard catch against Southwest Baptist. His second catch was a little more memorable. Copeland hauled in an 8-yard touchdown catch from fellow senior Gerald Posley in overtime to lift Western to a 27-24 victory at Spratt Stadium, sending the Griffins to their fifth win and into hysteria. Copeland was mobbed by his teammates in the corner of the end zone moments after Posey rolled right on a bootleg and fired a strike to the former walk-on. "It was awesome," said Copeland of being smothered by joyous Griffins after his winning catch. "It felt good even if I couldn't really breathe on the bottom." Okay, so this is the story of the game, right? So this is a guy who rides the bench probably his pretty much his entire career. He's a senior. He gets one meaningless catch earlier in the season, but here it is, the last game of his career. Comes in, catches the game-winning catch at the very end of the game to win it. I mean, that is, for those of you who've watched the movie Rudy, this is kind of a Rudy-like moment. Again, he rides the bench, puts in all this work, and but comes through in the end to triumph, to get that winning catch to win the game. That is the story of this game. That is the dynamic thing that happened in this game. And you can see the other example, again, it's not a bad story, but it really does not catch that drama at all. Okay, we have lots of great detail, lots of great stats, but that's not really the story of this game. The story of this game is this guy making this awesome catch. And so really the first half of the story is almost all this ending play, because that was the most important play and it had a great story to it as well. Okay, so later on in the story it fills in some of the other details and that, but you can see this becomes so much better of a story because of its ability to, again, tell a story, to find out the most important thing in that game and tell it well. Okay, so that is your job. Okay, so key to that is coming up with your leads. So I'm going to give a whole bunch of examples here. You can see I have my email address on here, so if for some reason any of you want to get a copy of these as handouts to hand out to your fellow classmates, maybe who couldn't listen to this presentation, I'd be happy to share those. Just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send you copies of these handouts. So most important thing here, again, for your leads, avoid those cookie cutter leads like this. So here we have the Northwest Missouri State men's basketball team beat Washburn 71-70 Wednesday night. Okay. It's okay as a standard inverted pyramid straight summary lead, but it's a cookie cutter lead, because all we'd have to do for the next game, so say they lost to Emporia State 78-64, 67 Saturday night. Okay, you can see how that's a cookie cutter lead because all we have to do is change the name of the team, the score, the date, boom. This can work, they could play 50 games and all we'd have to do is keep changing those words. So that's again a cookie cutter lead. It's boring. It's not a good lead. Okay. Also generally avoid, and this is especially novice reporters will do, is avoid having too much of your bad play on the team mascot. So don't say the Eagles soared, or in this case the Bearcats scratched their way past Western. Kind of avoid that over what is kind of overdone as far as the play on the mascots. Okay, sometimes it has its place if done right, but generally avoid those sorts of plays. So at the very least for your leads, you want to add in a little bit of detail. Again, typically about, again, what made the difference in the game. So here we have, again, led by 23 points and 10 rebounds from Shalom Dunk. The Bearcats beat Washburn 71-70. Okay, or a three-pointer at the buzzer from Shalom Dunk helped the Bearcat men edge Washburn 71-70. So you can see those are better leads because they explain, again, what made the difference in this game. This three-pointer at the end, these points from this player, etc. Okay, so consider that when you're writing your leads. At the very least, have that extra level of detail about why they won, not just that they won or that they lost. Okay, so again, you can go into a little bit more depth. Here for example, Shalom Dunk held the 2 points in the first half, exploded for 21 points in the second half, including a three-pointer at the buzzer, as the Bearcats beat Washburn 71-70. So there you have his what happened in the second half. You have his game-winning shot at the buzzer, and you have this final score. So that's as you can see, a much better lead. Here's just another example where you can go into, this is probably a little bit long for what you'd want to have as a lead, but just another possibility. But again, recognize that with these sports stories, with these game stories, as with feature stories, you can have a longer lead. They don't have to be, as with most inverted pyramid summary leads, one sentence under 30, 35 words. Okay, you can sometimes have longer, more creative leads. And so here, for example, if you want to tell the story of Shalom Dunk and his win. So 3 months ago, Shalom Dunk lay curled on the floor, screaming in agony and grasping his dangling left wrist, which was broken as he was trying to soften his fall after he was fouled intentionally going for a layup in a game against Drury. For 2 months, he endured countless hours on a stationary bike. For 2 months, he sat dejectedly on the bench in street clothes. For the last month, he struggled to regain his shooting touch. On Wednesday against Washburn, that shooting touch returned as he scored 23 points, including the game-winning three-pointer at the buzzer. Okay, so here the story is, again, this guy who had to struggle throughout the entire season because of this injury, coming back here, and this is his redemption, is getting that game-winning shot at the buzzer. Okay. So, including that sort of detail, you can see there's the other example here. I won't go through all the time in reading it, but you can read it later. Just another example of that. Okay, so you can use that. That's more of a narrative approach where you're telling a story. Here's more of a descriptive approach. Okay, and it's kind of combines a little bit of narrative and description, but it goes into more detail on the description to put you in the stands there. So instinctively, the 4,000 fans at Bearcat Arena rose to their feet. Excuse me, my typo, rose to their feet and took a collective breath as the ball left Shalom Dunk's hands. The senior, his left wrist still wrapped tightly in white athletic tape after being broken in a game 3 months ago, had already scored 20 points. He was left open when his defender collapsed on Strom forward, who was driving to the basket. Dunk tiptoed backward behind the three-point line, his arms outstretched, his taped hands beckoning for the ball. And then, of course, you describe him getting the ball and swishing it. So going into that depth, putting you in those last couple seconds there, painting the picture of what it would have been like with that electricity in the stands of him making that three-pointer at the buzzer to win the game by 1 point. Okay, so I'm going to give some other examples in another handout here, but just to kind of again show you to try and find what is the story of this game. And sometimes that's easier than others. Obviously, with a three-pointer at the buzzer, that becomes the immediate story. The next handout will talk about some other strategies when those stories aren't quite so apparent. So, Shalom Dunk's three-pointer at the buzzer against Washburn pushed Northwest into the conference lead with 3 games to go. Okay, or Shalom Dunk's last-second three-pointer popped Western's bubble on Wednesday night and kept Northwest on its own bubble, staying alive in its quest for the team's ninth NCAA playoff berth. NCAA playoff berth. Okay, with its last second win against Washburn Wednesday, Northwest ensured its ninth winning season. So again, trying to find out what the impact is on the season. So that's another approach. Sometimes using creative plays on words, references to pop culture, and things like that. So here using an old Britney Spears song, old for you guys, not for me. Oops, they did it again. For the second time in a week, the Northwest basketball team lost in overtime, this time to Washburn 87-82. Had to give Washburn a chance to actually win one of these games. Okay, so play on again, a pop culture song. So if there's any pop culture song that really resonates with your story, you can bring it in like that. So play on words. Here you can see, so one of the words for rowing for the crew team is sculls, SCULLS. That's the name of their boat. So it was super cold one day early, like in early March, and I was covering the Purdue rowing team. So while you'd think someone would be out of their sculls to climb in a boat in this chilly weather, the Purdue crew team was indeed in their sculls on Saturday, taking second place in the Indiana Regatta. So again, just using kind of a play on words. Again, you have to be careful not to be too cheesy, but occasionally some of those can be creative and very useful. So, give you some more game wrap-up tips. So again, this is another handout. You're welcome to email me. I'd be happy to send this to you if you think, again, you or your classmates might benefit from it. Okay, so this goes into a little bit more depth on the types of things you can do. So again, talking about the cookie cutter lead, trying to find the things, what can you focus on in your lead, in your beginning of the story. So here kind of is a 20 quick ideas for what to do in your lead, and so you need to just kind of, you can use this as a toolbox to think of, okay, what tool is going to work best for this story, which one of these aspects here might be the way to go with my lead. So this is just kind of a way to help you brainstorm ideas for what to do with your lead, or how to focus the beginning of your story. Okay, so obviously the most common one is to actually focus on the game itself. We'll talk about some other ones in just a little bit. But one of them is, of course, a play. So if there is a key play at the end of the game, or even in the middle of the game, maybe, or at the end of half, maybe that touchdown at the end of the first half, a pick six to really change the momentum of the game, maybe that's what made the difference. And so you could focus on that particular play, or again, a set of plays that really made the difference. Okay, so that's a very common one. The other most common one, of course, is a player. Okay, so if you had, Patrick Mahomes throw for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns, obviously you're going to be focusing your lead. The story of that game is this awesome game that Patrick Mahomes had, or bad game that they had. So focusing on a player is another way to go as far as your lead and your beginning of the story. Sometimes it's a group of players, so maybe 5 pitchers combined on a one hitter. Obviously, the offensive line in the Super Bowl against Tampa Bay made a huge difference. So looking at the defense, so other things like that, so you can focus on a group of players. Sometimes looking at a stat. Okay, so sometimes there's one key statistics. Maybe it's those four interceptions, or maybe the basketball team had 21 turnovers, or the baseball team had 6 errors in a game, or whatever. So what is the stat? Sometimes it's a stat that makes the difference in that game, and that is the story of that game. Okay. Sometimes it's a momentum or run. Okay, so scoring 21 unanswered points in the second half. Basketball or volleyball going on a 10-2 run at a key point in the game. So those sorts of things. Similar to that is if there's a dramatic difference between what happened in the first half and the second half, that can be the difference. That can be the story of the game, or coach's strategy, which sometimes can be making adjustments at the half, or maybe it's just the coach again having a game plan or making adjustments to that game plan that really made the difference in the game. Okay. Other times, if their key player is out or injured, or there's foul trouble or something like that, that can be the difference in the game and can be your lead. That can be your story. Officiating, generally, you don't want to get into too much. These other ones are more rare. If there is some, again, questionable conduct by the coach or players, or if there's lots of penalties, those are a little bit more rare, but sometimes are a good way to go. So I'm going to show you just an example, just looking at a box score of a game. So I'm pulling up here the national championship. So the 2021 national championship game of Northwest. So I'm a little biased here, of course. West Northwest versus West Texas A&M. This was a national championship game. So we're just going to walk through and kind of show you a couple different ways that you could have written or approached this story as far as what you'd wanted to focus on. So number one, obviously, this is a 26-point beatdown, and especially in a national championship game, to have a blowout like this of the two top teams in the country, and the one team just blew the other one out. That in itself is a story. And so one of the things you'd look at is whether this is the largest margin ever of victory in a national tournament game. It's actually not. It was 27 points, not 26 points, but that's the sort of thing you could look at. Just looking at some other stats. So here you can see the first half versus second half score. So already in the first half it was 48-29. So they were already getting the beatdown in the first half already. So the game was largely over in the first half. They piled on a few more points in the second half, but so the fact that this was such a blowout early on, and basically then they coasted to victory. Okay. One other thing just to look at too. So for example, just knowing additional stats and background on the game. So doing your research as a reporter and looking at things like stats and context can really help. Because, for example, this West Texas team, if you look on their stats page, they average 90 points a game. So the fact that they were held to 54 points that's the story in and of itself. Is, hey, this team that came in, they're a run and gun team, they're averaging 90 points a game, and they got shut down. And so that again could be a possible story. So just to look again quickly, so even without having gone to the game, just looking at the stat sheet, you can see a bunch of different angles that you could have pulled from in your toolbox. So obviously, if you wanted to focus on a player, Ryan Hawkins is that player. Okay, so the dude scores 31 points, a monster game. Okay, field goals 10 out of 16, a high percentage. He has also 18 rebounds, which is impressive. So he had what's called a double-double. So 31 points and 18 rebounds. That could be your focus, is on this player. So this All-American Ryan Hawkins scored 31 points and pulled down 18 rebounds to lead Northwest over West Texas A&M 80-54. Boom, there's a lead that focuses on that most important thing. Or you could have, again, 4 players scored in double digits for Northwest as they cruise to an easy 80-54 win over West Texas A&M. So understanding also some other stats is important. So for example, this guy who scored 19 points, West Dreamer, his average is 8 points a game. So the fact that he had 11 rebounds and 19 points, that could be a story of the game. Obviously, Ryan Hawkins kind of overshadows him there, but that's a key difference in the game that you'd want to, again, maybe not put in the lead for a story like this, but a detail you might include later. So some other things just to look at. Generally in basketball, 45 to 50% is the average shooting percentage. Here they scored 50%, including 57 almost 58% in the first half, which is very impressive. 3-point shooting is average is about maybe 35%. So the team scored almost 50% of their 3-pointers. So that obviously made a key difference in the game. Just to look at their opponents, so they only had 2 players in double digits. Usually they have 4 who have in double digits. And you can see here, a key thing, if you look at the stats, they shot 31%, which could have been their lowest shooting percentage of the entire year from 3-point land. They were 5 for 24, so they scored only 20%, 1 out of every about 5 buckets. And so that is a key part of this game, of this story, of this game, and so could be included again as possible things in the lead or other parts of the story. You can see also they got 24 rebounds. So you'd look at differences, key differences between the teams that made the difference. And so here's 24 rebounds. Northwest Missouri State had 36. So basically, Northwest Missouri State killed them on the boards, in large part because they were a larger team. So West Texas A&M is a small team, which is why their big man Ryan Hawkins was able to just again kill him underneath and score most of his points in the paint. So just to kind of again show an example of how you could use stats and the box score to figure out possible ways that you want to go with a game. Okay, just going to show you while we have this up here a couple other quick examples. Okay, so here's Benton high school game, first home game of the season. So you can see that they've highlighted that as an important part. So it's their first home game. Took an early lead and never looked back. So again, a good quick summary of what happened in the game. 6-0 win at Hyde Park. Okay, so pretty decent lead. Again, nothing. There might not have been anything else too much dramatic in here, but here you can see. So what they did is they took a chronological approach, and here because they won 6-0, it makes perfect sense to go with a chronological approach because there really was no drama. The key is that their first score that put them ahead, that they were able to actually just build on throughout the rest of the time. Okay, so very common. You have your lead. Okay, a nut paragraph that highlights the key scoring. Okay, and then again you have a quote. Usually you're going to want to quote again in the third, fourth paragraph, maybe as late as the fifth in some cases if you need a lot of description. Okay, so then we get those quotes and some of the background later on in the story. Okay, so just to give you another example here. Focus was on hitting. So what he's been preaching here is hitting. So that ended up being what they focused on the lead, because what made the difference in this game is scoring 8 runs in the 6th and 7th inning to pull out that 9-7 victory. Okay, so obviously too they could have focused on coming from behind, the fact that they were able to come behind from a deficit to score and win the game. So they went into the 6th inning trailing 3-1. Okay, those are all different ways that you can approach a story like that. So again, getting back to this here, so focusing on the game, the players, groups of players, stats, often is the way you want to go in your lead, in your beginning of the story. There's some other things that you might want to think of. So obviously if this is a rivalry game, that might be your focus in the lead or the beginning of the story. If the previous game they got blown out but this time they win, or vice versa. Okay, so the previous game they played or the previous game against this particular opponent, especially if things are dramatically different in how things turned out, or maybe it ended up being the exact same score, who knows. If they're on a streak, so if they're on a 5-game winning streak or losing streak, that might be your lead. That might be your focus for the story. If there's any other sort of trend they have, maybe they're winning all their games away or at home, either way. So maybe that's the key part of this game, is it continued this 5-game home winning streak. Okay, some other history things that come in, obviously things like senior nights, the first game of the season. So I gave the example there, the first home game of the season, the first conference game as they're starting these new aspects. So those are all possibilities as well. And definitely another historical thing is if there is a milestone for a coach, their 300th win or the program's 300th win or a player's 1000th point. Okay, those sorts of things all can be, again, a focus for a story. So again, these are all ideas to spark ideas for thinking about how can I start this story? What should I have in the lead? What should I have in the beginning of the story? What makes this game, again, different from all the others? Okay. Sometimes it is things like the conference standings. So if they by losing this game, they ended up now being in the basement of the conference, or maybe this win puts them into first place in the conference. That can be the lead. That can be the start of the story. Again, if this lead helps them get into the playoffs, if this game helps them get into the playoffs, things like national rankings, regional rankings, whatever, those are all, or seedings, whether they're going to have a home playoff game or away playoff game, those are all sorts of things. So looking at what are the implications beyond just this game? What does this impact have on their season as a whole? Okay, a few other rare ones there. Things again might be going on outside of the game, as we mentioned before. If there's a player who wasn't being able to play, who's suspended, sometimes weather can make all the difference in the world. Okay, so if it's muddy and rainy and your football offense is built on a pass happy offense, that's really going to be curtailed by this rain and mud, then that might be the story of the game. Or say your women's soccer and there's 25-mile-an-hour winds that really impacted, if you whether which side of the field you were on, and that influenced the game. Things like that can bring in controversies. Obviously, coaches leaving, being fired, new coaches, all that sort of stuff. So again, these are all different ways, all again tools to think of for coming up with those beginnings of a story. But these are also things to think about including in a game. So there might be something in here that might not be lead worthy, might not be want to make the focus of the beginning of the story, but it's important to mention. So these are all things also, of course, to brainstorm what to include in your story as well. So think about all these things as you're going through and writing your story. Okay. So a couple other tips as far as writing these stories. Number one, do include some game narrative. So what happened in the first inning or the second inning, or the first half and the second half, of course. Be careful not to go into too terribly much detail. Don't give a blow-by-blow description of everything that happened. Okay, so as I mentioned here, so if a baseball team wins by 1 run, hey, you are going to go into detail, maybe minute detail about how they manufactured that run. Okay, again, if it's a 6-0 blowout or 10-3, you don't need to go into this happened in the first inning, this has happened in the second inning, and go into detail about every run. So one thing to watch that especially novice writers do is sometimes they give this blow by blow description of the entire game. No, focus on other things, focus on more important stuff than exactly every single score. Okay, so the same way if you have a football game that's 7-0, yeah, you want to go into great depth about how they scored that touchdown, or maybe how their defense stopped the other team at the goal line at the end of the game. But again, if it's a 44-35 blowout or 44-35 game, describing each one of those touchdowns is going to be too much. So be sure to include other things in the story. Okay. Some other things, obviously the score, again, almost always you're going to include that in the lead, at the very least by the third paragraph. So unless you're doing something super creative, super different in your lead, where you want to kind of tease the reader a little bit, or maybe the score isn't the most important thing in that game, maybe then you're going to put it in later. But again, almost always you're going to include that in the first or the second paragraph. Okay. So some other things to include in the story. Typically, you're going to include the team's record. Again, usually both overall as well as in the conference. And you also want to include the opponent's record as well. So that gives the context for the reader. So if this team is 10-1, your team beating them means, hey, this means a lot. This team is a really good team. They were 10-1 coming into this game, and we just smoked them. Okay, or if this the opposing team is 1-10, and clearly this is a game that your team should have won, and so it's important to have the reader should have that context of what this win means in terms of the opponent's record. Okay, so do always get quotes from a coach. Okay, so always generally try and have at least the coach and a player. If you get two players, that's even better. So this could be again be it like two track athletes and the coach, people who did well. So again, typically you're going to want to pick people that again made a difference in the game. So so try and find those people again at a track meet who won their events, or especially somebody who might have set a school record. Okay, so those sorts of things. So try and always find the coach and at least one or two players. And again, try and have some direct quotes in there to again help spice up the story so it's not just a recounting of whatever the contest was. Okay. Okay. And again, remember that you're telling a story. Figure out again what made this story different. Okay, so sometimes again that's super easy. Again, if it's that shot at the buzzer that wins, obviously that story almost writes itself in some ways. But you're going to have times when it's going to be tougher. So I give the example here. Your team is 2-13, and they just got killed 86-48. That's when really the good writers shine because they can make that story interesting. Okay, so just an example. So in a 2-13 season filled with disappointment, there was a glimmer of hope for the future in Springfield's 86-48 loss to Johnstown. Freshman Jane Smith had 13 points and 10 assists in her second start as point guard, and sophomore Mallory Anderson led the team with 15 points and 10 rebounds. While the losing margin was the biggest of the season for the Lions, Coach Ellen Fritz was encouraged by the emergence of those two players, and other players will be back next season. Okay, then you'd have a quote from the coach. So here you have again a boring game. They got blown out. They lost. You try and find again what the story is. The story is, hey, in a year or two, this team might be significantly better because these underclassmen are showing some promise. So that is what you make for the story. Okay. So just some final tips there as far as how to write game wrap-up stories. And I'm going to conclude here with just some quick tips. So beyond the game, obviously we focused on game wrap-up stories here. That's the bulk again of what a lot of people write, but your sports section should have many more types of stories. And so this again is just a brainstorming list for covering if you're covering high school or covering college. Here's a list of some possibilities again. Hopefully that might spark some ideas for you about how you might want to expand your coverage beyond just those game preview or game wrap-up stories. Okay, so a signing day at your school. So when high school students sign with a college team, obviously that can be a good story to do. Typically at colleges, not as quite as common as at high schools there, but at colleges they'll have quite often a weekly media luncheon where they might be interviewed by the TV station or the radio station. Sometimes at the beginning of a season too, there's a preseason conference luncheon where they might also be voting, the media and coaches may be voting on who they think is going to win the conference. Okay, so there's some media-oriented type stories like that are common. Some other ones, anything dealing with changes in rules and regulations. Okay, be it NCAA rule changes or state high school athletic association changes, anything they're they're messing up. And obviously, during the time of COVID, tons of changes that were going on there. So, any infractions that your athletes have, or problems with boosters or whatever, anytime players violate team rules, academic guidelines or whatever, get suspended, kicked off the team, etc. Those are stories. The more extreme examples of course, when coaches or players get arrested, or again the penalties are levied on your school, or whatever. Those are good stories as well. Some couple musts, or at least shoulds, that should be in yours, are columns. So one thing I would have to say about this is, don't write a freaking column about the NBA or the NFL, okay, or MLB, okay. You want to write what people can't get anywhere else. And there are tons of columns about, again, the Chiefs or the Royals or the Cardinals. You want to give them what they can't get anywhere else, and that is a column about your school and your teams. Okay, so provide that and that sort of introspection, that level of analysis that, again, they aren't going to be able to read in other places. So really think with your columns. Again, it's not a crime to have to write a column about who do you think is, going to win the NBA championship this year. But really, as much as possible, try and keep those columns local. Okay. So other things, obviously, season previews are really things that you should have, as well as postseason. So a preview of the season. So what's the team look like? Who are the best players coming back? Who did they lose? What's the prospects for them this season? And then, of course, an analysis at the end of the season, how they thought it went and what things look like for the future. Definitely, if there are coaches hired and fired, be sure to be covering that, as well as if there are any changes in the conference in terms of its makeup or, again, its rules. So make sure to have those sorts of things. Make sure to also have features. So on players, on coaches. It could be trainers. It could be your band, your equipment manager. All these sorts of things. Think about possible features, and definitely if you have an alum from your school that's made it good at again, in the professionals or other sports, okay, that have gone on to do well, definitely do features on them. So think about what alums that you have that are doing well beyond just what they did at your school. Okay, sometimes like team stats. So say your team is leading the state or the country in field goal percentage or 3-point percentage or something like that. Those are good stats to look at to perhaps do stories on. So if your players are all shaving their head, if they're getting tattoos, if they're all wearing matching clothes or whatever, or if there's any other weird traditions, things like that make great features. So don't just chuckle at those. Think like a journalist and think, wow, that's a story. People would want to get to know more about that. Okay, so just give some other examples of various types of features you could do. Some other types of stories, definitely award stories. So anytime your athletes get All-State, All-American, whatever it is, those are the sorts of things that make for good stories as well. So when those things come down the line, remember, as a journalist, think, hey, we should do a story on that for our paper. If there are national stories that are going on, so for example, I'll use the example of curling. So again, I curl. So say for example, the curling team was that in the gold medal round. They were set to win the gold medal in the Olympics. So you might localize a story like that by covering, hey, there's some people at your school that do curling. So what do they think about all this attention being paid to curling and the U.S. team perhaps winning the gold medal? Okay, so the same thing with other times when these sports are kind of on the national hot seat, and talking to local coaches and players for their reactions. So I give a whole bunch of examples of investigative reporting. So this is a whole nother, again, presentation in and of itself. Again, I'd be happy to pass along to you sometime if you wish. You can also email me that. I do have a PowerPoint that I've used for presentations that give a whole bunch of ideas for possible investigative stories, and then I list a bunch of other ones as well. So, again, just hopefully this was able to give you some ideas for stories, some tips for writing a specialty game wrap-up stories. And like I said, if any of you would find the handouts from this presentation useful, I'd be happy to email you those. So just shoot me a quick email. I'd be happy to send you a note back with all these copied. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Have a great day. Again, hope you've learned a lot, and take care. Bye.